Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mrs. Colkhorst. First, I want to assure you that if we're talking about protecting life, I remember the Senate stands with you. But I want to examine what lives are we protecting. We're protecting the lives of all babies? Or do we think that a baby who survives an abortion has different rights than any other baby who's born at the same gestational stage?
Well, in Senate Bill 23, it amends that portion of the law that is about children that are born alive.
Now, would you say that babies who are born outside of an abortion context have fewer rights, lesser rights than babies who are surviving an abortion?
Senator Johnson, I know where you're going with that, and I would say, of course not. Every baby has a right. And for me, every baby has the right to be born, not to be aborted. So this bill goes straight to that abortion and says even though you're terminating this child, this life, and I believe that life begins at inception, even though you're terminating it, if it is expelled, and if you want to read that part of the code, it's very graphic, if it is expelled from the mother's womb and does take a breath, that in 1979, 29-1 of a vote on this Senate floor, carried by a Republican and then by Gene Green on the House floor, a Democrat, they agreed overwhelmingly that that child should be rendered aid. And what this bill does is toughens that. And let me tell you why we're talking about this today. It is in direct relations to some of the comments that we've heard nationally about maybe this should be between a patient and the doctor on whether or not that baby should live or not. And I would say that the original Senate Bill 117 actually was created in 1979 off of another direct action in California when a baby had been suffocated, that this legislature in this building decided that Texas would take a very bold stand. So where some of the other states are a little ambiguous, this is an attempt to make sure that Texas is not ambiguous.
And let's take the situation where a physician denies aid to a viable child that is born. That's a horrible act, you would agree, correct?
Yes.
And outside an abortion context, it could be that a physician refuses to render appropriate medical aid to a viable child that is born. That could happen, right? And that action of denying care to a baby would be no different if it's a baby that was born in a normal context than it would be if the same baby were born in an abortion context. You're still refusing to give that child a chance at life, correct?
When you're saying that a baby was born in a hospital
anywhere
versus a clinic?
No, I'm saying that you could have an obstetrician who delivers a child outside of an abortion context, but it's premature. It's 22 weeks, going to need intensive neonatal care, and the physician declines to do it. That's wrong, isn't it?
It is definitely wrong, and I have physicians that sit on this floor and would tell you that. And that is why I worked on House Bill 13 and a follow-up bill that you actually voted for in Health and Human Services, the committee that talks so directly to our NICUs and the quality of NICUs that we're trying to create.
Right.
And so not all children are born in hospitals with NICUs, but most are. Now,
but you're making it a criminal penalty to deny care for a child born alive in one instance, but not a criminal penalty for the exact same occurrence in another instance. So is this about protecting life, or is it persecuting a physician or harassing a physician or intimidating a physician who assists a woman in the exercise of her constitutional rights in a manner consistent with that physician's own religious beliefs, which we spent a long time trying to uphold last week on Senate Bill 17? Isn't this inconsistent?
I don't think that it is. And when I read quotes by certain elected officials in other states that say it would be up between the patient and the doctor to decide whether or not that child lived if the abortion failed, I think that Texas, just like we did in 1979, when we stood up to California and said we will not stand for that, I think this bill does the very same thing.
And I'm
makes
with
it
you.
Abundantly clear.
Senator Kokos, I'm with you. If the child's born alive, that's something that we should make sure that child is cared for. I'm just saying that any child born alive should have the same protections. And I think you've got an inconsistency here. And I will be offering later an amendment that makes this applicable to all children born prematurely, to any child who's born to any physician in any context, not just a child who's an abortion survivor. Meanwhile, back in our Health and Human Services hearing, we did have testimony. Do you recall how many of those witnesses testified to an actual instance of a doctor who performed an abortion refusing to provide services to a child born alive?
I remember the testimony of the father of Clara Caldwell, who spoke very passionately and handed out information about her survival. And I know that there's a network that is very viable throughout the nation that is bringing this more to the forefront. And I know that actually now abortion is being discussed more, and I think that pro-life is beginning to win. That everyone sees that every life is a viable life. And so with that, I know that we've heard stories all over the nation. We've been lucky. I've been lucky to meet some people that have survived an abortion, and I've also been really moved by a text message that I read during our hearing that I think you were there to hear. And I'm happy to read that text message again about how babies had been put in bedpans and left to die and put in another room so that they don't live.
That wasn't a witness, and I don't really know the circumstances of people talking in that email, and it wasn't clear from the email. What I do know is that no one testified about any physician ever denying services to a viable child, including Claire, and I'm sorry, I do forget her last name and have a great deal of respect for her courage, but she herself was not denied medical care. The 269 members of this organization, not a one of them have mentioned being denied medical care when they were born prematurely. So again, I don't see this bill as truly being aimed at a real problem, at a real threat from abortion doctors. What I see it is aimed at physicians who want to practice their profession consistent with their own beliefs and the constitutional rights of their patients.
Senator Johnson, are you saying that the CDC and their statistics are erroneous?
I just wrote those down. You mentioned statistics about how many births there were that resulted in deaths. There was no statement in those statistics as to the age of those deliveries. Was that 9 weeks? Was it 26 weeks? 13 weeks?
Underestimating the vagueness in the reporting because there is such vagueness.
And so I have nothing to go on other than that somebody thinks that recorded some instances. Most abortions, 99% are performed before 20 weeks? For all I know, these statistics have to deal with 8-week or 12-week pregnancies, not the ones that you and I really agree, these viable children that are born. You and I agree those children deserve to be saved. But if we're talking about a first trimester abortion, those are not compelling statistics, certainly not compelling enough for me to impose criminal, civil penalties and anonymous hotlines against physicians who are practicing their profession nobly.
They do not apply if the baby is, and again, this is when the baby comes out of the womb and is alive. This is a born alive bill, okay? And I would just say that, the thought of an abortion at any week is something that is hard for me to fathom. And I know those statistics. Senator Lucio and I spoke about those statistics today. Many children are aborted. But this is about on the rare instance that a child is born alive, that we make sure that we render aid and get that child to a place where they can survive.
Thank you. And so I'll sum up, and I do appreciate you fielding my questions with saying that if anyone is to support this bill, you've either got to recognize that you're voting for something that is inconsistent and not really pursuing the purpose for which it is presented, or you've got to adopt an amendment that extends the same protections across the board to every birth with an obstetrician and imposes the same kind of penalties, the same reporting requirements, the same criminal provisions to any physician who does this. Otherwise, you're just aiming at doctors, you're not protecting life. I am not concerned that there is any physician who performs abortions or doesn't perform abortions who would refuse to provide medical services, and I've not heard any evidence to the contrary, and I have faith in the physicians of this state. So while I'm not supportive of it, if we're going to go forward with it, I think it has to be as amended, and eventually that amendment will be passed out. But thank you for addressing my questions.